touched base with on some time before, and the reason that this has kind of been on my mind a little bit as of late is going back through my reading of scriptures. I've most recently come through and completed 1 Samuel, and I think there's always a lot of lessons. You know, for me, I have always been big on telling everyone, like my mantra growing up was, I don't have to hit the brick walls going 70 miles an hour if I let and witness other people do the same thing. You know, you don't have to learn every single lesson the hard way. And with individuals in Scripture, it's much of the same. You can help kind of glory in what individuals had achieved and what they've done right, and you can kind of incorporate that same attitude or that same outlook or the prayers and hopes and desires that they had into yourself and upon yourself. Because if they are desiring after God and emulating a lot of His attributes, obviously that's something good. Well, there's certain individuals, and sometimes the same individuals, who veer off the path, who, you know, they're a little left of being right, and there's much left to be desired, you know, putting it simplistically. And I want us to take a look at something this morning with Saul. And again, I'll give you a few more moments to get to 1 Samuel chapter 11 if you're not there. Kind of a recap on what I touched base with last month. I know Ron wasn't here, I believe, when I last spoke. I think most everyone else was. I preached a message titled Or. If you know Hebrew, that makes a lot more sense than English, because it sounds like I'm up here stuttering the same word. Actually, that's 3 different words. One is in English, the other 2 are in Hebrew. For a more simplistic, memorable title for all else, I named it Messiah, Moses, and Adam. And what we had done is we started with Jesus in the Gospels on the Mount of Transfiguration, and we had shown about in those events with Peter, James, and John about how there was this transfiguration that had kind of taken place, about how Jesus, not only his garments, but his countenance as well, shone bright. There was something different about him at that moment and with that experience. Started with that, of course, like I said, because people are more familiar with the Gospels than what they are perhaps in the Elder Scriptures and the Old Testament, as we call it in the Hebrew Scriptures. Then we went over to Moses, and we had taken a look about how he spent the time up there in the presence of God and what happened when Moses came down off the mountain. He actually had to wear a veil because he was shining so brightly that the people actually couldn't look upon him. And we linked with what happened with Jesus, with what happened with Moses, and we carried that same idea or that same thought over to Adam. Of course, whenever Adam transgressed, what had happened? Well, they actually, made the garments of figs and they covered themselves because for some reason they were suddenly aware of their skin and they were suddenly basically aware of their nakedness. And what's the big deal that's beyond that? Well, remember the title, as I mentioned, of last month was Or. Now, again, I don't try to sound like I'm something bouncing a ball off my nose. There's 2 words in Hebrew that are pronounced Or, and one of them is skin. And then the other thing that you have, the other word Or, actually means light. And if you start examining and taking a look at the differences between skin and light and the spellings in Hebrew, and of course if you do the mathematics beyond what the letters have, you actually come up with a statement means supporting the serpent. It's funny how Jesus, he had the light with him. Moses had the light. And then after the fall of man, all of a sudden man notices his skin and that he's naked. And so we kind of brought up the idea of what happened here, what happened there. Well, what happened with Adam and Eve? They supported the theory of what was going on with the serpent. And this is going to kind of be a part 2, in essence, of what we spoke on and what we touched with last month in the month of January. And what I want us to take a look at this morning, and the title of this is An Ancient Enemy. And I know there's a bunch of people who, as I've said before, they really love to read the New Testament. Obviously, I do as well. I like reading the Old Testament as well because it provides a deeper challenge. There's more that I can kind of sink my teeth into as far as a lot of word plays, a lot of word studies I'm yet to be familiar with. I like the challenge. I've spoken with some individuals and they say that they really love Paul because, in essence, in their opinion, Paul really kind of gets a lot to the point, has some really good examples, which I don't refute that. I do have to laugh whenever people talk about how Paul is so easy to understand, but then you have Peter, who actually spent 3 years with Jesus in his earthly ministry, said, yeah, he speaks a lot of things I don't understand. So, to each his own. I like throwing that part out there too. But this is one of the chapters that whenever I was coming through and reading, a lot of the stuff came flooding back, and I started having memories of some of the stuff that I came across in my personal independent studies that I kind of think might be a little bit of a benefit to us. We're going to read the whole beginning, actually this whole chapter, and then we're going to start back with verse 1 and kind of reevaluate some things here. And again, 1 Samuel chapter 11, it says that Nahash, the Ammonite, came up and encamped against Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, "Make a covenant with us, and we will serve you." And Nahash the Ammonite answered them, on this condition I will make a covenant with you, that you may put out all of your right eyes and bring reproach on all of Israel. Yeah, I know, I like speaking on the weird things. Then the elders of Jabesh said to him, "Hold off for 7 days, that we may send messengers to all the territory of Israel, and then, if there's no one to save us, we will come out to you." Then the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and told the news in all the hearing of the people, and all the people lifted up their voices, and they wept. Now there was Saul coming behind the herd from the field, and Saul said, "What troubles the people that they weep?" Then they told him the words of the men of Jabesh. Then the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he heard the news, and his anger was greatly aroused. So he took a yoke of oxen and cut them into pieces and sent them throughout all the territory of Israel by the hands of messengers, saying, "Whoever does not go out with Saul and Samuel to battle, so it shall be done to his oxen." And the fear of God fell upon the people, and they came out with one consent. When he numbered them in Bezek, the children of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah were 30,000. And they said to the messengers who came, "Thus you shall say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, tomorrow by the time the sun is hot, you shall have help." Then the messengers came and reported it to the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. Therefore the men of Jabesh said, "Tomorrow we will come out to you, and you may do with us whatever seems good to you." Now so it was the next day that when Saul put the people into 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp in the morning watch, and killed Ammonites until the heat of the day. And it happened that those who survived were scattered, so that no 2 people were left together. Then the people said to Samuel, "Who is he who said, 'Shall Saul reign over us?' Bring them in, that we may put them to death." Now, bear in mind, prior to this, Saul was anointed as king. It was kind of brought out that he was going to be the one that they had wished for, the one that they had requested, because after all, Saul's name in Hebrew is Shaul, which means requested or requested of, apropos, yea. Verse 13, "But Saul said, 'Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished the salvation of Israel.' Then Samuel said to the people, 'Come, let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there.' So all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. There they made sacrifices and peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly." Father, thank you so very much for another opportunity just to be able to share the Scriptures, your written word, with everyone here this morning. And Father, as we're gathered together, Father, I ask that your Spirit be among us. Father, may it minister the seeds that will be sown here this morning. Father, I also ask that you protect us from error, protect us from distraction. And Father, I pray whatever is sown here this morning may grow into something more. And Father, I just ask that you be with me in the words that I speak, Father, that they may provoke thought, may provoke research, and many other things. And Father, let us just love you with all that we have this morning in your holy name. Amen. All right, so we're going to go ahead and go through a few different portions of this chapter a little bit again. Just kind of want to get the overall story so that you know what takes place. Nahash, he comes up at a time, as I mentioned, right after Saul basically, this is going to be Saul's coming out party. This is Saul's first opportunity really into the eyes of people to either be make or break, so to speak. And if you actually kind of know some of the things that I've taught before, Nahash, like I said, might be a familiar name. In Hebrew, it's Nahash. And the whole reason why I bring that up is if you take a look at his name, the very first instance where you find the word Nahash mentioned in Scripture kind of sort of goes all the way back to something we had already talked about this morning with the fall of man. Of course, who are the characters in that? We have Adam, we have Eve, and who else? We have the serpent. That's because in Hebrew the word serpent is Nahash. And bear in mind, what is his condition to make a covenant with the people? Nahash the Ammonite in verse 2 answered them, "On this condition I will make a covenant with you, that I may put out your right eyes and bring reproach on all of Israel." Now, one of the things about this, if you're familiar with a lot of other things in Scriptures, just off the top of my head, I know Ecclesiastes makes mentions of the difference of like the left and right, but I also know the Gospels make mention of it, Acts makes mention there unto the right hand of the Father, on and on and on. If you're really familiar with a lot of the things that happen, like with the Levites, whenever they're being anointed, whenever they minister, what happens with them? Well, they have the right thumb, they have the right ear, they have the right big toe. That's actually with the blood. That's another thing that takes place. And not to mention, if you're familiar with like church history, the word that we have left comes from the Latin word meaning sinister. You know, if you actually look in some of the other prophets and some of the other books, it talks about the sheep to the right and the goats to the left. Well, whenever you hear something mentioned on the right side, it denotes kind of a mention of spirituality or spiritual strength seeking towards something of God. And of course, if you know the culture, the left hand is for more earthly duties. We will leave it at that. But whenever you see that it talks about he's wanting to gouge out their right eyes, I think that speaks a lot because, you know, whenever I've touched on this topic in times past, like I said, I talked about right represents a lot of spiritual matters and a lot of spiritual things, and left is, again, more earthly duties, leaving it at that. But think about the practicality of it all. Think about if something were to happen to you and you were to lose an eye. How would that affect your life today? How would that affect your life now? And the reason I want to bring that up is because some of the things that would happen is you would actually lose some of your depth perception. You know, a lot of the times I remember being a kid, one of the things that was making the news quite a bit, quite often, silly enough, things that stick with you is those laser pointers. People were barred. You would actually get sporting event tickets that said no recording devices and no laser pens. Well, why? Well, they get one of the laser pens, they shine it in your eye, however far away they are, you're rendered incapable of being able to use that because it compromises your vision. You lose depth perception. If you were someone who is an enemy, think about it. If Nahash had moved in to this area and he was wanting to be dominant, number one, he would bring reproach to all of Israel by having them do this. It kind of puts the people in their place. It shows that we're better than them. It shows that they had to settle for a compromise even to be able to live inside my presence. So that was one of the things. Also, if they ever decided there was a time that they wanted to revolt against him, with there being a lack of depth perception, especially it being their right eye, a lot of the equipment they would use, shields would be on the left a lot of the times from what I understand. A lot of their attacking maneuvers, they would be right-handed. So there's a lot more practical detail things that we might miss other than just saying the whole right hand represents a full stranglehold of spirituality. Nahash the Ammonite answered them, "Gouge out their right eyes." The elders of Jabesh said, "Hold off for 7 days that we may send messengers to all the territory of Israel. Then, if no one is there to save us, we will come to you." So the messengers of Gibeah came to Saul and told the news in the hearing of all the people. And all the people lifted up their voices, and they wept. And Saul came coming behind the herd of the field, and Saul said to them, "What troubles the people that they may weep?" And they told him the words of the men of Jabesh. Then the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he heard the news, and his anger was greatly aroused. So he took a yoke of oxen and cut them into pieces, and sent them throughout all the territory of Israel by the hands of the messengers, saying, "Whoever does not go out with Saul and Samuel to battle, this shall be done to them as it was to the oxen." One of the things that really stands out to me here is, you know, there's this old adage and this old saying, I'm confident most everybody, if not everybody here, has heard. What is it? United we stand, divided we fall. There's some enemies, there are some things that we face We can't rely on just our individual resources to be able to cross the bridge on. There are times that we have to pull together as a community to be able to help one another, give each other the support, because a lot of the times we're already in a rough enough place of our own. I know everybody probably thinks of different circumstances that they faced. I know of things that I've come across in my life that I thank God I had the support and the community that I had. Would I have wound up okay enough? Well, sure. I probably would have wound up okay. But being surrounded by people who have the love of God and the love of Christ with them, building the person up as an individual, one of the big things that immediately comes to mind is whenever I lost my father years ago when I was 14 years old. That was now almost half of my life ago. And then whenever you take into account the years before I even was able to conjure up memories from whenever I was a year old, 2 years old, 3 years old, by the time I was 4 and 5, I can really start remembering a lot of the things, that carved into the amount of time that I was with my dad. And that really helped form me, obviously. But I was thankful that whenever my dad passed away, that I was surrounded by a bunch of loving people who were willing to step up and be there, not just for a kid, but also the wife that he left behind, showing us the love of Christ, showing us the love of God. And I know that's kind of an extreme measure to take, or kind of an extreme example to use, because I know not everything is that to that degree, but for personal experience, that's what I had. And it really kind of shown us a lot of the power of unity, and that was one of the big things there. One of the things I think is neat here too is, we made mention that Nahash in Hebrew means serpent. There's another individual that kind of comes to mind, conjures to mind for two different reasons. Nahash is saying, you want to live here, you want to live in this territory, I'm in your backyard, you have to compromise. You have to gouge out your right eyes, you have to lose part of your vision. You have to compromise your vision, so to speak, to be able to stay here. Or, in effect, what's not said is he could make his best attempts to wipe them out. There's another individual who proposed a compromise to Israel in their history that's also associated with snakes. May not come to mind quite as immediately, but that's Pharaoh. Now, why is it that I say that, that he's affiliated with snakes or that he's affiliated with serpents? Well, not just because the staff of, Moses and Aaron and some of the wonders that happened there, but have you ever seen any of the Egyptian headdresses? They actually had the cobra up front and center. There was one or two of them. It's been so long since I've actually studied that back in school. But what was one of the things Pharaoh was speaking to Moses? What did Moses want to do originally? He wanted to be able to get the people. He wanted to go bring them out of Egypt so that they may worship the Lord. So what was Pharaoh's response to that? Well, maybe you and some of the elders can go, or maybe you and some of the men can go, but leave your children behind, leave your families behind, leave everything else behind. Well, God did tell them to go out and worship, so what's the big deal with that? Well, it kind of accomplishes what God wanted done, but it also kind of appeases two different masters, so what's really the harm, right? Moses said, no, that's not good enough. One of the things Nahash is doing here is he's throwing out a possibility of compromise. It seems like in the Gospels it talks about one cannot serve two masters. You'll either love one and despise the other, or hate the other, whatever wording that you have on your translation. Something else I thought was kind of neat here. We've already talked about it, and at the end of the chapter it talks about that they anointed Saul as their king, but who was Samuel? Samuel was their priest. And part of the reason that I named this message this morning as an ancient enemy is Saul had to do something I think that each and every one of us have to do. And it was almost a very origin story back in Genesis. There's going to be moments where we're going to find our serpent. There's going to be moments where we have our encounters with an ancient enemy that we have to fight and we have to face. Adam and Eve, you can have your own opinion on what happened and had taken place there. Here we see Saul. What's his very first battle that he's got to do in his position? He's got to fight that serpent. There are mornings where I wake up and as soon as I clock into work, very first thing I've got to do is not be a serpent myself to many other people for reasons I believe understandable and perhaps not so understandable. But it's something that I have to do every single day. It's a battle that's common to me, is not to compromise and support the idea of the enemy. It's less than, and Jesus didn't die for less than in my attitude. But I do find it interesting that the king and the priest were the two men who were mentioned by name who had to go into battle. Who is our king and who is our priest? We have that in Jesus. And that's one thing that if we really try to rely on just one aspect, it's a good vision, but it's not both sides of the coin. We have to be able to see him as our priest and also our king. And the fear of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out with one consent. And when he numbered them in Bezek, the children of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah were 30,000. They said to the messengers who came, so on and so forth. Verse 11, so it was on the next day that Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp, and in the morning watched and killed the Ammonites until the heat of the day. And it happened that those who survived were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. Then the people said to Samuel, Who is he who said, Shall Saul reign over us? Bring the men that they may put them to death. And verse 13 says, But Saul said, Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished the salvation of Israel. This battle, this opposition, was something that was a big deal. You know, like I'd mentioned earlier, with them gouging out the right eyes, one of the things that were potentially going to be a big deal was being humiliated by the enemy. Brought reproach, made them look weak, made them look like that they were serving a lesser God than to the other people. Made mention that they lost effectiveness in battle if they were to give that compromise. Losing an eye would mean losing the depth perception and peripheral vision. We've already mentioned the stuff with the serpent, some of the stuff with Pharaoh. One of the things I also want to mention this morning is just kind of a few other verses. You know, we made mention of Paul. I want to go ahead and mention that too while I throw all the other paperwork away. Going back to the image and kind of going back to what I spoke on last month about, you know, Jesus having the light. With Moses also having a light of him. And then, of course, my theory and my speculation is Adam had some sort of thing about him. I think it's neat that in the book of Romans, chapter 13, verse 12, the night is far spent and the day is at hand. Therefore, let us cast off the works of darkness and let us put on the armor of light. It's something that we've got to do, and I love that it says here that it was the armor of light. Because one of the things that you read whenever you start studying the life of Abram and Abraham, once he makes the name transition, he says one of the things is, I will be your shield. A type of armor, a type of protective mechanism, that I will be your shield. And of course, me loving the word plays and digging everything I can to the Hebrew, the word shield in Hebrew is magen, or it could be perhaps magon. I'm not that great at it, it's just a hobby, people. But if you take that very first letter, say for example, if my house where I live, I'm from the town of Roland. If I were to say that in Hebrew, that I am from Roland, they don't have a word like to, the, from, like. They have letters that you put on the beginnings of words to help convey that thought. Well, if you put the letter mem, the m that I mentioned on again, that means ma Roland, that means I'm from Roland. Well, if you take that mem off of shield in Hebrew, you're left with the word Gan. What's the big deal about Gan? Well, anybody ever heard of Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden? Whenever God says to Abraham that I will be your shield, you could also have a wordplay that says from the garden. You can have a relationship with me as though it was from the garden. Whenever he says, I will be your shield, I will be your protection, it's almost like here in my mind, almost like having on that armor of light, being surrounded by light. I love 1 Corinthians 15, I believe it's 49. We have borne the image of the man of dust. Now let us bear the image of the man of heaven. May we be the salt of the world. May we be the light of the world. In 2 Corinthians 4, 3 and 4. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their cause, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is in the image of God. Those are the three verses that just kind of kept reiterating back through my mind as I was studying this chapter a couple of weeks ago. And, there's times to where I'll read Scripture, and it just doesn't feel the same. One thing that I've said before, whenever I worked at Acme, I was in a very blessed position. I wasn't making the most money in the world at Acme. That being said, I was making more then than I had made at any other job. Now I'm making quite a bit more. I liked Acme. I loved the brick plant. That's why I always throw the joke out there. I can sympathize with the Hebrews for having to move on from places of them making bricks and kind of wishing they could go back every now and again. Not for the same reason, obviously. But the thing with Acme is, I could clock in. I had a whole day to myself on Fridays, Saturdays. I was literally told by my supervisor, my main job today, for these 2 days, this weekend you have here, do not die. That's going to be a lot of paperwork Monday morning if you do. Beyond that, stay here at the brick plant, survey everything, watch movies, listen to music, do whatever you want to do. His job about hit the ground and asked him if that meant I could bring my Bible and read and study my Bible. Guess he had some other strange requests, but that wasn't one of them he thought he was going to hear. But having that whole thing to where for a whole weekend, I was able to study the Scriptures. Man, I loved it. I've told you guys before about from January of 2018 all the way to September, I wound up logging about 1,400 hours where I was just studying, reading, translating, going through classes, going back and forth, writing things out. And I love doing that because that's my passion. Forbid it be something that a lot of people other think would be useful, but I was on clock, couldn't do a lot of other jobs, but I was granted to do this, so made the best of a situation. Nowadays, I don't have that time. It's actually rough whenever you work for a living that you actually have to work at. But, my grievance for another day. But it's brought a lot of opportunities. It's brought a lot of the things into our life that really a Jeremiah Darden from 2 years ago didn't have available to him. They talk about for insurances that you have like vision, you have health, you have dental. For the cost of what 2 of those things cost for just Gavin and myself to have, at this job, we can have vision, dental, health, a few other bells and whistles for everybody in our family, even the little member that we have coming on board in the next couple of months, for right about the same price as what the other 2 things cost for just my son and myself. A lot of people said, would make mention, like, you talk a lot of Acme. You really loved that job. I loved where God had me then. But God has brought me to a place now. It's not that we need to be fixated on what the past was. Be appreciative of the past, learn the lessons, and if possible, bring as much of that part with you to be able to move forward in the future. God was pouring a lot of things into me in my life at that time that He's actually using now. Now we have the blessing of being able to extend the family. We're going to be welcoming Charlotte in the next handful of weeks, couple handfuls of weeks, however you want to say that, next couple of months. God has blessed us in a lot of ways at this new job at Silgan that Acme wasn't going to be able to afford. And so whenever I talk about things of Acme, don't think that I just want to live in the past. I wish I had the time availability to study the Scriptures, but who knows what the future has in store and hold. Maybe I'll have it, but I'm actually being effective. I'm actually able to have a personal relationship with coworkers now. My last job, 12 hours in my shift, I might have had to deal 30 minutes with other people. I liked being by myself. I've also come to find out this job that most people aren't too bad. But I actually have a chance of all the things that I learned in Scripture, things I incorporated in my personality and my attitude, being able to feel the presence of God in my life. I now have the opportunity to be the light to the people, to show them what that is. And one thing I think was kind of neat, if you go over to verse 14, then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there." So all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. They mentioned it. They mentioned it at least 3 times just in that little bit there. And something I think is neat that I came across a couple of years ago through Grant Luton is the word Gilgal, the location Gilgal, just the name of it. It's awful close in spelling to another location that's familiar to most of us, especially in the New Testament. Two things I want to mention and bring up before I mention and disclose the location that I'm talking of that I've yet to say. What was it that Saul had cut up that he had sent out to all the other people? Oxen. Now, there's a letter in the Hebrew alphabet, Don, that means ox. And actually, it's the very first letter, of course, of the Hebrew alphabet, and that is the letter Aleph. What was it in the very beginning of this chapter that Nahash wanted to suppose to the people? Make a covenant. Then in verse 2, it talks about a covenant. You know, there's actually a letter in Hebrew that whenever you say it, it actually means covenant. You know, Aleph was the first letter. Well, the word that means covenant, or the letter that means covenant in Hebrew, is actually the final letter in the Hebrew, which is Tav. It's the Aleph, it's the Tav. A lot of us actually know the term in Revelation, the Alpha and the Omega. If you attach to Gilgal and put into Gilgal the Alpha and Omega, the Aleph Tav, you can actually come up with the term and name Golgotha. Kind of neat that in this chapter you have battling a serpent, you have, in a way, the Alpha and Omega mentioned, you have the king and you have the priest mentioned, and then you also have the location, what's missing from Gilgal to make it Golgotha, the Alpha, the Omega, the Aleph, the Tav. Just a lot of little things that are all through this that I've found in this book. And that's part of the reason I love pouring time into the Old Testament just as much as I do the New Testament. You know, it talks about the beginning is in the end is in the beginning. You know, I know it's on Isaiah, it's in Jeremiah where it talks about, you know, I am the first and I am the last. I have the beginning and the end and the beginning. It all points back to one another. And I would say that there's this new wave coming through the church and some of the believing community that are trying to differentiate and put distance between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Ron can tell you that's not the case. That's something that's existed right as there was an establishment of the New Testament. Even before there was an established New Testament canon, there were people trying to dismiss anything and everything to do with the Hebrew Scriptures, trying to put their own spin and trying to capture this lightning in a bottle that was the Jesus revolution, so some of these people thought. And if there's anything I can just kind of encourage you, I hope, with this morning is if we are wanting to know and have this armor of light and be able to bear witness to other people about this goodness of God and how he was able to come in and redeem us in so many ways, don't limit him to the words of the New Testament. Also be able to find him in the words of the Old Testament as well, and of absolute ultimate importance as well in the context and the letters of your life and the words that you speak to other people. If we are someone who is going to be able to be a Christian, someone who is a little Christ, it's important that we wake up every morning and realize some of our very first battles is going to be able to battle the serpent. You know, I've mentioned before about how you read about Moses, a lot of times you read about Jesus, you read about David, you read about Jesus. And we see that Moses was offered compromise from Pharaoh. And I've mentioned before, one of the neat things about the word Pharaoh in Hebrew is if you take the bookend letters, the first and last letter of Pharaoh's name, just Pharaoh, you're left with the word peh, which means mouth. The two middle letters means evil. So inside his mouth is evil. And what evil was it that Pharaoh was speaking? Well, he was kind of brash and adamant against the face of God. That's another story for another time. But what was the big thing that he was offering Moses? He was offering compromise. He was attempting to offer less than. You know, whenever we read the New Testament, we get into the Gospels, we really start digging into the fabric and the life of Jesus' earthly ministry. There was compromise that was offered and extended towards him. Anybody ever heard of the temptation of Christ? There's a lot of the things about that from a logical mind point, oh, you shouldn't say that. It's spiritual. That's borderline blasphemy. No, you have to look at this in the terms of reality. When Jesus, whenever he crossed over, did the whole thing with his baptism with John, he went 40 days, 40 nights in the wilderness, exposed to any and all elements that were there. It said he was hungry. I can sympathize with someone being hungry, maybe not necessarily so in my case, but I can sympathize with someone being hungry. What did Satan tell Jesus to do? Turn this stone into bread. Was it logical? He went 40 days and 40 nights fasting, you tell me. It was something that seemed logical, but was it a compromise on the mission that God had given to Jesus? It was. When it talked about show yourself at the top of the temple and come down from the temple downward, I don't think that's something that's actually written in the Hebrew Scriptures, but it was a dominant teaching among the rabbis in the first century climate, and at that time, that the Messiah was going to reveal himself of coming down from the temple amongst the people. Did Jesus want to be recognized as king? That's a yes and no answer. That's kind of one of them. You can kind of get two different ways. Did he want, is Jesus king? Is he really king? Well, yes. But there were certain things that had to take place, and what happened with the elder and the leadership there? They rejected him. Somebody is really tempted by something, they really hope in some aspect that it's going to be a possibility. Jesus did 40 days, 40 nights in the wilderness. If he was hungry, it might be a temptation for him to want to eat something. Somebody lays a banana in front of me, I'm not going to be tempted. I don't like bananas. I don't know what's up with that. I've tried my hardest as a child, never had good results. I am not tempted by a banana. Everything that Satan, if it was going to be a legitimate temptation to Christ, it had to be something he would want to go with to some capacity. But he wasn't willing to allow compromise. He wasn't going to compromise the kingdom for a crown. Best way to put it. Whenever Adam and Eve supported this idea of the serpent, they lost some things. In the beginning, they were covered by their Creator. After the fall, what happened? They had to cover themselves with creation. And if we fight the ancient enemy, and we hope to find ourselves in victory, we have to find ourselves covered by the blood of the Lamb. And just as a reminder of some of the verses we read earlier, we have been born in the image of the man of dust, Adam. Now let us bear the image of the man of heaven. And adjoining to a prior verse in the book of Romans, the night is far spent and the day is at hand. Therefore let us cast off the works of darkness and let us put on the armor of light. It's our decision if we engage in this battle or not. And if we dare call ourselves a child of God, a son of God, a daughter of God, let us be equipped with everything he is willing to give us. Father, thank you so much again